It was water rhythm for guqin, saenghwang, Korean percussion, found objects and electronics composed by Jeff Roberts, performed here by Jeff Roberts on guqin, Gamin on saenghwang, Woonjung Sim on Korean percussion, danso, found objects, and electronics. Welcome to Camp Podcast. I am pianist Eunmi Ko, and I serve as president of the Contemporary Art Music Project, or CAMP. CAMP is an organization that promotes innovative art music and collaborates with composers and performing artists. One of many activities we do is our podcast series. All episodes are available for free on our YouTube page and Apple Podcasts. You can learn about a wide range of topics from marginalized musicians in Western music history to current collaborations between living composers, performers, ensembles, and other arts organizations. Subscribe to Camp Podcasts. Tonight, I am your host, and I am thrilled to talk with Jeff Roberts, who is a composer, improviser, and researcher working in interdisciplinary areas of acoustic and electroacoustic composition and improvisation, experimental music, and East Asian music traditions. His music explores relationships between different music styles and cultures. Jeff Roberts currently teaches at the University of Alberta as assistant professor. Hi, Jeff. Welcome and thank you for being here with me.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we usually start with a kind of background question, and you are a composer, and also we just heard your beautiful performance. By the way, it's really interesting and beautiful music.
Thank
I
you.
enjoyed it. And you are also a performer. You play this Chinese traditional instrument, guqin. So if you can share how you encounter with this instrument, and where and when, and how you developed your kind of musical research.
Sure. Well, my original training in music was as a improvising guitarist. So I studied at the third stream, now called Contemporary Improvisation, and I think they also changed their name recently at the New England Conservatory of Music. That was in the 1990s. And third stream department was a improvisation program that emphasize the kind of internalization of traditions, usually through learning melody, through singing. So before we touched our instruments, we had to learn to sing many different types of melody from different genres within the West, but also from different music traditions throughout the world. So it's a really innovative program, and it's going strong today with many musicians from cultures all over the world now studying there. So I was exposed really from the beginning of my training, or the beginning of my professional training as an improviser, to um, traditions, music traditions throughout the world. And in this context, I discovered Chinese music and Japanese music. We had to learn how to sing some of that, and in the context of my initial interest in composition, where music timbre is a really big interest for Western composers or people who participate in the Western tradition. The guqin is a tradition that has a very important aspect of a very important aspect of it is the timbre, how you listen to the changing timbres. So it was sort of first in the context of improvisation that I encountered that, and then some years later, when I started my PhD in the early 2000s, I started having a more direct interest, not just in the guqin, but in Taoist related aesthetics, Chinese aesthetics. My influences in Western classical music have a broad range, but because I'm originally from New England, from Massachusetts, I had a particular connection with the New England transcendentalist thinkers in Concord, Mass. In the 19th century, and also Charles Ives, who was from Connecticut. And their nature-based intuitive aesthetics, which Charles Ives followed, um, was was really important to me, because of that nature connection, and also because of how that sort of way of thinking in the 19th and the early 20th century laid the foundation for experimental music in the 21st century. So there's a whole idea of intuition, which is sort of rooted in my improvisation background, made me look towards Chinese philosophy. And so Taoism has the same kind of idea of kind of an intuitive connection with the natural world, and guqin is a 3,000 year old tradition, kind of continuous 3,000 years old. So there's no other tradition and the world that actually has lasted continuously for 3,000 years. Like the instrument today looks pretty much the same it did in Han Dynasty, which was 2,000 years ago. So it was sort of on that foundation that I became really interested in guqin, and um, and interested in a particular teacher. The teacher that I eventually studied with, Li Xiangting, I went in 2006 on a Fulbright to study with him, and I ended up studying him for a year and a half. So the guqin tradition itself, if you look back through the dynastic era, improvisation is not necessarily a direct or a clear part of it. The scores are notated. They're scores, but they have um, more of a mnemonic function to remember what your teacher taught you in terms of figurings when you go home. But you really learned the rhythm and the stylistic uh, uh, playing, copying your teacher from the oral tradition or from listening. So what my teacher did differently was that he, starting in the 1950s and early 60s, he started improvising on guqin, in part related to folk music, where there might be some improvising in different folk music traditions in China, but also related to the aesthetics of the guqin that really holds spontaneity and naturalness in a really high position. So he started improvising based on uh, impressions from Chinese poetry stretching back to the Tang Dynasty, and so there's a concept in Chinese aesthetics called yijing, which means immediate emotional impression that you receive from a work of art when you observe it or listen to it, or um, uh, impressions that artists have related to uh, the real world or poetry or something that they immediately react to, and they use that as a kind of a basis for their own expression on guqin or as a painter. So I was really interested that this was a uh, you know a tradition that was deeply rooted in a very different idea of spontaneity than might exist in jazz music, which I studied, or intuitive ways of playing, and then this teacher took that much further and actually started improvising. So as an improviser, I thought, wow, it would be really interesting to be able to internalize that world, not just the Qin world, but all of the history of that as a foundation to and understand what that means, what that idea of spontaneity and intuition means, and improvise from that perspective. So that's sort of the the reasons why I went to study. And this was also, now by the time I went to study, I was also a composer, composing notated and experimental modern classical music. So I always had the intention, because my language as a composer has a very spontaneous, impulsive character to it. So I always had this idea of internalizing the guqin tradition as a performer myself, but then using my intuitions and impulses as a Qin performer in the same way maybe a Western composer might use piano to compose music. So I was really think of it as a kind of a performer composer model, but now with a Chinese instrument rather than excuse me, a Western rather than a Western instrument. Excuse me.
Yeah, that's fascinating, really. And it seems your education and also in a way that you educate yourself and expose yourself to this kind of you talk about intuitiveness
Hmm.
um, a lot, and that seems to be very different from um, most of young music students um, learn, how to compose or how to play instruments. These days, it's very, in a way, um, kind of a boxed education. It seems like you go to university, you go to
Hmm.
college, and go through all your degree programs. So,
Hmm.
compared to that you had this master teacher, and really um, observe what he's teaching. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I would just make a comment on that. The way that I had thought about it was, um, when I became interested in and I started playing guqin, by that time I had already kind of gone through some of the 20th century, even 19th century Western classical music repertoire, and was looking to see how composers um, borrowed ideas or were inspired by cultures outside of their own. And the kind of the maybe the kind of go-to model or the default model is to hear that music and maybe study it and then kind of borrow elements from it to bring into a Western composition. And I think the thing that's different about Charles Ives is that his language that he wrote, especially pieces like Central Park in the Dark, um, that was written, I think, in the first few years of the 20th century. At the time, you know, classical composers were composing, using ideas of form that existed in the 19th century and before. And they have this, almost all compositions have a linear development. So there's an idea of sense of development and progress. And the thing that really interests me about some of Ives' music was that it's the first time in maybe Western classical music that a composer wrote a nonlinear piece, meaning he was trying to describe in Central Park in the Dark his actual experience, so that he was using Western instruments and techniques to emulate the flow of the breeze through the trees on a Friday night in Central Park, or the kind of the wafting in of um, uh, music from bars or speakeasies. But there's no development in the sense of taking a theme, developing it, moving it through a exposition, a development, a recapitulation where you're manipulating ideas. It's sort of like a more of a representation of his experience or his representation of the real world. And so that that has a very different quality to it. Um, and just getting back to uh, the training and thinking about going to China and training, um, there's all kinds of those qualities, but in a very different way in Chinese music, especially Guqin music. And so I thought, that idea of borrowing as a Western classical composer, maybe based a little bit on my experience in the third stream department. We're constantly learning music from different cultures. That I felt like if I was training in the West, or I came to the West from another culture and wanted to dedicate myself to composition, then I would come here and study. Or same thing with jazz. Now these days you can study classical composition in China. That's sort of the main music education. Um, so I felt, if I was going to do that, if I felt this connection, then I needed to immerse myself in the music in the same way that I had been trained in the traditions that I was trained in the West. So it's that idea of internalization, making it something just like when we memorize these melodies in the third stream program. The whole idea of the memorization was internalization, so that you live and breathe those melodies. Those melodies become a part of your consciousness, so that when you are on stage ready to improvise, they come out naturally. They come out and they're mixed and they're blended together with everything else that you know. So I think that process of internalization was really important to me. And when I first went to China, I didn't expect to be a professional guqin performer or performing, you know, with an ensemble and you know, playing concerts on qin. But as I got more into it, I became very interested in the playing the instrument, the performance practice part. But not, you know, so now this, you know, now it lives within me, and you know, I've been playing for guqin for over 20 years, and you know, I practice every day. You know, it's just as if I was a guitarist. I practice every day, and so I think of it as a sort of an internal part of myself now. So I think that you know, that's always what I wanted, and although at the time I didn't realize it, it's actually what unfolded over the last 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's great, and became, you know, part of you, and now you have an ensemble with this different traditional instruments. So now maybe we can talk about the ensemble, and it's certainly very interesting. And again, some of the pieces you sent me, I listened to, and they're just absolutely beautiful. So it's called Pan Project,
Hmm.
uh, and I think you can probably start telling us about the name itself, because I always thought it's very meaningful name.
Yeah, sure. Pan, in it's a Korean word, so pan, kind of in a broad sense, means to gather, or to come together, um, maybe as a community, or originally maybe in a village context. So in Korean music traditions, pansori is a kind of a singing storytelling tradition that, pan means to come together and sori means music. So um, so there's a, you know, there's this idea of um, community, in the concept of the ensemble. Um, I mean, the origins of the ensemble come from conversation that I had with my uh, collaborator Gamin, co-artistic director. We were at some improvisation conference, maybe in 2014, and you know, at this conference they had the intention of making kind of intercultural improvisation a kind of a focus of the conference. And there were some very interesting, some very good um, collaborations and some discussions on intercultural improvisation. But one of the things that I was left with after I did that was, this is after I had lived in China for over 6 years, in Beijing, and was involved in the kind of the composition world in Beijing and also the improvisation world. And one of the things that I had noticed, you know, being in Beijing and collaborating or learning guqin and kind of, you know, living there and seeing other musicians from North America or Europe and come there, you know, one thing that I felt was sort of disappointing sometimes was the you know, the collaboration between Chinese musicians and Western musicians, that on in the kind of the structure of how they would collaborate to in improvisation, um, there's almost this immediate tendency to shift to Western ideas of improvisation, free improvisation, or even North American ideas of free improvisation, to the detriment of the instruments that were mostly Chinese, but some Korean and Japanese musicians, or even an Indian musician. Uh, but so that, you know, there was this sort of presumed meeting place for these intercultural improvisers that was default Western, and so that those concepts sort of took over the improvisation. And from having studied Chinese music and understanding what not just the Qin music is about, but a lot of Chinese music or East Asian music, there's a huge loss or a huge gap in understanding. Uh, of those traditions. So it's probably most of the time, Chinese traditional musicians are also trained in Western music, so they have some concept of Western music, that these musicians from the West are bringing in. But on the other side, there's almost no concept of Chinese or Korean or Japanese music from many of the musicians who are coming to collaborate. And so I felt that the conference we were at had some sort of the same vibe. So when Gamin and I were talking afterwards, we were thinking about creating an ensemble. It's primarily improvisation ensemble, but we do write and we do perform composed music. But China, Korea, and Japan as a kind of a cultural regional location have a tremendous intercultural history in and of themselves, that is so fascinating, is so rich, that why don't we create an ensemble where that's the starting point, that's the foundational language, and that we can incorporate anything that we want into that, but just by fact of being musicians who are playing these instruments and know these traditions. And even if a Korean musician doesn't necessarily know Chinese music, there are kind of intercultural connections between them that you can hear, that you recognize, like, for example, note shape, a bending pitch. So that's sort of the foundation of the idea for Pan Project. And our first album is completely focused on East Asian traditions. All of the music is drawn from Korean, Japanese, and Chinese traditions. But the idea of Pan, we're thinking, and we call it project because we didn't necessarily want it to just be the same concept of the same ensemble, but more thinking of it as a project-based ensemble where we can bring in all kinds of different combinations of musicians, or work with other art disciplines, and kind of make it this place for kind of exploration that might be centrally located in East Asian traditions, but could go anywhere.
Great. Um, we can probably listen to one piece and continue talking. So you sent me this word Kangwon,
Mm-hmm.
which is based on the Arirang.
Mm-hmm.
This is in the on the album.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you like to talk about it briefly before we actually listen to the piece?
Yeah, sure. So, like you said, Kangwon is a arirang, which is the most well-known folk melody of Korea and also known worldwide. There's many different versions, regional versions of it. So this is a version of the melody that is from the Kangwon region of South Korea, and it's in sort of a minor scale, and it's in a 5/4 or 10/4 pattern. And the concept that we're kind of using in terms of improvisation is rooted in Korean traditions. So Korean traditions, in the um, shaman traditions, there is improvisation, an ensemble improvisation called shinawi. So what we're doing is we're sort of developing improvisation based on a Korean improvisation tradition, but having these different instruments from East Asia, from China and Japan as well, to explore that. So just by the nature of putting these instruments together and having them perform in a Korean improvisational context already makes it very exploratory, because the feel and the style of Shinawi improvisation is very different from very different from Japanese and Chinese traditions. So just by playing Shinawi, and I'm trying to, and sometimes imitate instruments, Korean instruments, it's a very, it's very experimental from an East Asian perspective.
was Kangwon by Pan Project. Um, Performed here by Gamin on piri, Ned Rothenberg on shakuhachi, Wang on erhu, Jeff Roberts on guqin, Woonjung Sim on changu. Yeah, it's a fun piece, really. It's so enjoyable. I think
Yeah,
you
I,
probably
I
got a lot of good feedback
yeah,
on.
I love playing Korean music. There's something about Korean music that's not present in Chinese music, which is the rhythm and the accent. So I'm drawn to Korean music because of my background in jazz and the
Mm.
kind of the driving rhythm and accents that exist. So it's very natural for me to play that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems so far from each other, jazz and this East Asian Korean music, but maybe not really.
You know, especially the minor third in in the Korean scale, the ba ba ba. That's and how you bend notes is very. I find it very similar to blues in some ways. Yeah.
Cool. I know that you had another recording session because met you very briefly in Korea
Mhm.
in this summer. So yeah, can you tell us about your recording session and what was the how was the occasion? What was the occasion and how that go and when it's going to be published?
Yeah. So we're recording music for a second album. The name of that album is going to be Borderless Flows. And I hosted a big festival and conference in September 2022 at the University of Alberta, funded by a large federal Canadian federal grant called a SSHRC. Uh, and we were able to. So the foundation or the idea of the conference and festival was to resituate the discussion of um, globalism from the modern Western colonial foundation of what we know today as this interaction of cultures throughout the world. Um, we wanted to kind of resituate the discussion about that in talking about a type of globalism that happened, perhaps most well known is the Silk Road era, where this trade routes or these regional trade routes connected that stretched all the way from eventually from Rome all the way to the capital of China, but coming out from India, going through Persia, Arab lands, Central Asia, and you know, so this type of globalism, what when scholars talk about that in the modern day, in many different fields, they talk about it um, as a new phenomena or a phenomena that's described based on the history of the last 200 or 300 years of colonialist expansion by the West out into the world. And there's sort of either a downplaying of um, intercultural interactions on a kind of a international, intercontinental scale prior to Western colonialism, or they don't even recognize that that has been the case. And so that's what the conference was about. And the festival brought my ensemble Pan Project and another ensemble, the Aga Khan Master Musicians, uh, which represented Central Asian, uh, uh, let me see, North African, uh, and uh, and Chinese. Wu Man, the famous P-pop player, is a member of that ensemble. So we really had these two ensembles that were reflective of the traditions that interacted cross continent from East Asia all the way into North Africa. in this historical period as a way to explore these traditions. So historians or scholars study documents, they study tangible facts that they can try to unearth and understand what happened in these histories. But as musicians who participate in these traditions that were a part of that, we're not simply constructing a historical exercise, because all of the musicians are musicians today in the modern sense, and these musicians think in a modern way, not just trying to recreate the past. So having these ensembles come together in the context of scholars who can talk about these historical traditions, we're trying to combine a type of kind of intellectual knowledge of this interculturalism on the Asian and North African continents with a type of experiential knowledge, meaning musicians who can play and experiment, compare and contrast techniques between different cultures, melodies, scales, things like that, and just explore through improvisation, which could possibly lead to new insights about how the intercultural developments happened that might not be in documents or in the past. So that's the kind of the foundation of the idea for this album. So we're naming it Borderless Flows, and much of it is rooted in East Asian traditions, but we're bringing in Persian and Indian and Central Asian musicians to collaborate to create an album that is more reflective of what this festival and conference was all about. So in the particular recording session in Seoul this summer, we worked on two pieces that were derived from Korean traditions. So I sort of composed sections or melodies that we improvised on that with our singer, Seon Jung, to develop an improvisation based on shaman ritual. So the sort of a modern composition that has roots in shaman ritual. The second piece is based on some ongoing collaborations that I have with a Korean gaegeum player. So one thing I'm focusing on right now is learning gaegeum techniques on guqin so that I can compare what might have been transmitted, what might have come from Chinese traditions versus what are truly indigenous Korean traditions. So there's a lot of similarities between the timbres and the note shapes on chin and gaegeum. So our second one is a more of a free experimental improvisation that kind of explores those connections between chin and gaegeum. So yeah, and it went well. We're very happy with the pieces, and some of our other musicians are going to add to those. So we have a design so that we're just 4 people, but some of those pieces will become seven performers. So
Yeah, it's exciting. And it's going to be released by Numa Records.
yeah, it'll be reduced by Numa sometime in the first part of 2024.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll definitely keep our eyes open for it.
Yeah,
Can't.
and that piece Water Rhythm will be on that as well.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Um, Maybe we can listen to one more piece and then continue um, our talk.
Okay.
This is Igu Ren, if I pronounce it correctly.
Pretty good.
And it's played by you on guqin and Ned Rothenberg on shakuhachi. It was Iguren, performed here by Jeff Roberts on guqin and Ned Rothenberg on shakuhachi. My next question is probably a more difficult one. That's um, it's we always like to ask about the music education and also future of new music or new classical music.
Mm.
Where should we go? Are we going right direction, or what can we do to stay creative and also teach our younger generations better? So um, I felt like new music went through a lot of different phases, and especially these days, there's so many changes with technology and just social context. It's been a bit crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And people talking about, oh, artists can be replaced by AI, all kinds of things. So yeah, what are your opinions on this? And also, um, it's probably relating question that you earned a PhD from the Brandeis University music program, and we are all shaken by what happened to the program. And a lot of us also are very worried about the university patronage and their support and all this PhD higher music ed program.
Mm.
So yeah,
Um, well, I think, you know, let me just briefly mention my reflection on AI.
yeah,
Um, I heard a lot of different opinions from uh, scientists or uh, computer programmers who made AI and what AI is. Um, One of the interesting things that I heard, which I think is true, is one of the creators of AI referred to it as pastiche, which is it's creating it's creating something based on a collection of things that already exist. What is in the knowledge base of that AI program. Um, so I feel like just like technology before AI, even when synthesizers first emerged, there was a worry about um, the replacement of musicians by this, and that certainly has happened. Film composers use vast orchestral libraries to write the music, so that means they don't hire orchestras to play it. So it definitely had a negative impact. But I think anything that human beings create can be thought of as a tool, and it's really uh, what you can do with it, um, and how you explore it to create something new. So I think if someone purely relies on AI to generate some general idea of music, even if it like internalized all the repertoire of Stockhausen, then it could come up with new variations on Stockhausen. But maybe AI is a starting point where what's being generated is not the final product. So how composers use that to construct their own concepts. I don't think it's a question of replacing composers, but I see it more as a tool. The other thing that AI doesn't have is the personal spiritual experience of making or performing music. So, in terms of function and how music functions, we can go back to kind of basic music cultural principles of how that music functions in your life. And it's not just it's not just the creating a product. It's a community, and it's a process, and I know, you know, it doesn't matter if AI ends up writing pieces better than I do of my own style. I get satisfaction from finishing the piece and going through the struggle myself. So I feel like, the threat of AI, in the context of artists, it's a personal journey as an artist, that I do it because I like that experience. So I think of it a little bit differently. The future of music. that's a that's a big question.
Yes.
Well, I guess maybe what I could contribute to that question is my own perspective from having studied um, historical trends in human cultures interacting. So uh, looking back and seeing what transpired on Silk Road era, looking at back at seeing, this is talking anywhere from 100 BC to 1400 AD, looking at how China, who is a receiver of influences from West and Central Asia, sort of integrated and assimilated those, after which they passed them on to Korea and Japan. So there's a whole process of discovering the intercultural developments just within East Asia before Western colonialism began. So, one of the observations that I have about that, which I think can be applied to any part of human history or even the modern day, is a social anthropologist, Arjun Appadurai, who um, created new ways of thinking about how we study um, individuals and how they identify with groups. So, historically, anthropology looks at geographically located cultures, and that you have to go to that region and study the culture in that region because that's where that culture exists. But the problem in the modern day is at least some percentage of the world, and maybe increasing percentage of the world, is becoming more cosmopolitan because they're traveling physically through air to different locations and are exposed to um, new cultures much more, or being born in one culture and then living in another culture for education and maybe going to an even different culture. So there's this sort of a kind of accumulation of um, perspectives that develop in the individual that maybe you can't talk about in terms of like a traditional anthropological study of a culture in a region. He calls this an ethnoscape. So he believes that you have to understand individuals as they move throughout the world today, and understand their lived experience, which is very dynamic and different, and involves multiple cultures and perspectives than maybe if you studied cultures in the 18th or 19th century. So that you know embedded in that concept is this idea of cultural imagination, which has to do with when you are growing up and you know absorbing and learning in the culture in which you were born. Um, you um, you have a particular identity of yourself that's based on how the culture that you've grown up in or the context. So, but when you encounter a new culture, um, your your concept of yourself, your identity changes because you're being exposed to new ways of thinking. And that sort of cultural imagination is the same today when you're exposed to new things as it was in the 8th century on the Silk Road. And so I think that, how that intercultural interaction stimulates new thinking, new ideas, that, a lot of changes over traditions in, East Asian histories or Central or West Asian music histories happens because of exposure to new ideas. It's a stimulation. And so, when you apply it to, the modern context, and you talk about something like the future of, modern classical composition, um, you know, the world is continuing to evolve with ideas of, identity or identification, or recognizing the, the cultural hegemonic um, energies that have come to shape a particular culture, a culture that involves multiple different ethnic groups or ethnicities. And so, you know, I'd like to look at Western classical music in that broader historical context, kind of stepping outside of the tradition itself and looking at how Western classical music has moved throughout the world. Western classical music and Western music in general has permeated the world through the context of colonialist Western cultural hegemony. So that's, there's a lot of negative things to be said about the impact that that's had. A lot of the traditions and different cultures in the world are largely unknown to people of that culture because the imposition of Western culture and music has permeated and changed that culture. So, but that, there's no gatekeeper about how things should unfold in human history. So it is what it is. We can counter that by, recognizing under, discriminated groups or underserved groups, under appreciated groups, and help giving the voice so we have a more pluralistic world that we can speak and recognize variety. But from a musical perspective, kind of basing this on observations in this Asian cultural history, intercultural history, the same thing can happen to Western classical music and probably will at some point, meaning Edward Said, who is sort of the founder of Orientalist studies, mentioned that the tide of Western influence out into the rest of the world moved in that direction from the West outward. But he said, as evidenced in other parts of human history, eventually that ebbs and other currents start flowing other ways. And so I think that, on the one hand, or I can say Western classical music has already been influenced a tremendous amount. Innovations have come from other cultures. Like Stravinsky's innovations were actually in some way based on the folk music that he grew up with. When music analysts were looking at his music, like Boulez, they discarded the discussion of where that influence came from. So they didn't talk about Russian folk music. They just talked about the innovation that it brought, like the intervals or the rhythms, or the sonorities. So that's already happened. But now that we have a population of composers that is expanding throughout many different cultures of the world, we have Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Indian, and so on, musicians or people who have been, who are from that culture, with conservatories, Western ways of teaching music, Western music, that are now central to music education in those cultures. In China, the first conservatory was in Shanghai in 1926. And now there are conservatories all across China and Western music departments all across China that vastly outnumber the number of Chinese traditional music departments. So I think, on the one hand, you have Western classical music being assimilated, or adopted by these cultures that the Western colonialism had impacted, And so, on that global level, there's many people from across cultures participating in the Western classical tradition. The thing that I'm interested in is how, when these musics exists for longer periods of time inside of these cultures, how do they change? Um, it's true that younger generation Chinese musicians, a large percentage of them don't have any idea about Chinese traditional music because they're never taught that. It's completely absent from the education system in any systematic way. But there are more musicians who are composers in China who may have been brought up studying pipa, and so there are things that are uh, happening with musicians where they're starting to bring in these things as a practitioner of their cultural traditions that they were brought up in, and bringing that into music. And so that change, I think, is very interesting, very incremental. I think in terms of the future of classical music, what's it going to look like in 100 years? Maybe not like 10 or 20, but how is this going to evolve historically over a period of time that's similar in comparison to the Silk Road, 500, 1,000 years. I think those are the longer term things where you can, begin to see um, how a music that was originally adopted from a foreign culture, like Western music, into China, how does that change? How does that community of composers change, not just in China, but in this kind of, internationally or globally linked tradition? So I see it from that sort of broad historical intercultural perspective. And I can say, for my experience of practicing Chinese music and sort of really internalizing it, and also doing it quite a bit with Korean music as well, is that there are so many different innovations that get triggered in my mind, like the inspiration about how to do something or what direction to go. It's like having all of these ideas, even just related to guqin technique, and how that stimulates my mind to think of a direction in my composition or a new sound shape or something like that. I think there's infinite possibility of innovation when you have that sort of interaction with that culture. I think Bartok was asked, he wrote an essay to kind of comment about the idea of, this is in when fascism was rising in 1930s. They asked about, what is more beneficial, a racially impure music tradition or a racially pure music tradition, which Nazism you know, had
Mhm.
put this theory of Aryan race as being the supreme
Mhm.
race, and they wanted it to be pure. He said, actually, when context creates something unexposed and pure, it tends to become one-dimensional. So when his studies of North African cultures, which were separated by deserts, the music tend to be more one-dimensional, not as much variation. But in Eastern Europe, when different regions of Eastern Europe uh, interacted, the variation and turnover of melody and how all these things are created, he said, is almost infinite variety. So he basically said that intercultural interaction is the lifeblood of a vibrant music tradition. So, and I believe that. I mean, I think my own experiences has shown me that, and I hope there's with equity, diversity, and inclusion policies that are becoming more focused, and definitely in Canada, also North America, depending on where you are, that you know there's a more broad embrace of creativity across cultures, that allows students to have more opportunities to interact with that, or be more stimulated to interact with that on a deeper level, so that they might go just past the idea of borrowing, but actually might study an instrument and feel more connected to that. And then with all of those kind of internalizing of those traditions, all new kinds of sparks can happen for new ideas and innovation. So I think maybe in a
Mhm.
broad perspective, but I really believe in that. I really feel like the interaction between cultures really creates some of the most interesting innovations in history. And I think you can also find that in the history of Western classical music with composers like Stravinsky.
Yeah, I think it's just all tied with, in the beginning you mentioned the ibis, and it now you're talking about this intercultural idea, and I think it's just all fits together. And yeah,
Yeah, I think it does. It's exciting. I mean, I'm not saying sticking with one tradition is not exciting. I chose Brandeis University because I came from an improvisation background, experimental background, and Brandeis is known as sort of a really solid education in composition traditions, and I have all these ideas of experimentalism and improvisation from my past. But when I went to Brandeis, I didn't really have that as an undergraduate. The discipline of writing tonal music, writing like Bach, writing those things. And so I kind of feel it's a little bit like Jackson Pollock. He was classically trained, but he ultimately kind of quote unquote broke the ice because of having that training that kind of created a foundation for him to jump off in a completely new direction. So, Brandeis is such an important a program, a composition program. It's a small, tight knit community that produces just a tremendous amount of really great composers that vary, that are not all composing necessarily purely notated music or music that connects back with 18th and 19th century traditions. So and what's happening there, this is not the first time that I've heard of it. When I was there
hmm.
2005, they instituted a new dean of arts and sciences, and he had come with um, a proposal that was purely based on a financial analysis without any consultation to close the graduate programs in music. So it's this very disconnected, dry economic decision that didn't really take into account any of the history of the department or the value of having arts, and not just arts, but graduate students who are interacting with undergraduates. I ran a class on American experimental music while I was a grad student there, and it was a full enrollment, and the undergrads loved it. They you know I I had them do like a recording project because I dealt with experimental music and field recordings, and one of them had an interview at a mutual fund company on Wall Street, and they were going to go into finance, and she went in and secretly taped the environment in the mutual fund company and then used it as the foundation for a composition. So I mean, it's just that type of free thinking, innovation, even with someone who might be interested in working in, in finance or on Wall Street,
Mm.
you're never going to get that if you just study sciences. I mean, maybe her way of doing that breaks open some new innovation in finance. I mean, you just don't know where those are stimulated, but that's why it's you know, culturally and educationally so important to to have that. And if you have something that's a program like Brandeis's program that's so well established, and a lineage of great uh, composition faculty and musicology faculty that are now teaching and leading other departments throughout North America or even in Europe, that to arbitrarily cut that, it's clear short-sightedness. It's something that the humanities in some way are under attack um, because of this desire by kind of business style management of universities to professionalize their universities, that they're completely oblivious to the kind of the larger goals of universities, and actually what make university education great.
Yeah, I think it's always kind of PAN, the university music program and education that brings everybody and all different kinds of ideas and different thoughts and languages, and then just like PAN,
Hmm.
that you create something new, you respect difference and you create something new, and
Yeah,
it's a place where you can freely do it. So um removing that is just really tragic, I think.
it is. I mean, I hope there's enough momentum, um, not just from the Brandeis community, from the alumni and the um, donors and supporters, that makes them, uh, really realize that they're making
Hmm.
a fundamental error in doing that. Um, they retracted before, in 2005, but it's a different administration, so I don't really have any familiarity with that. But hopefully, the huge outpouring of protest from
Yes.
will change that. I hope.
Yes. Well, I wish we can just keep talking, but unfortunately, we have limited time. So,
Sure.
um, thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts and music. It's was just really really a treat. We usually make our exit listening to music, so um, we're going to say bye now. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
very
so
much. This is a great project, and I really enjoyed talking today.
Thank you. Now we're gonna listen to 12 Landscape Views 3. It's for guqin, soprano, saxophone, and electronics. You will hear this performance by Jeff Roberts on guqin, Philip Stodlin on soprano saxophone. Support us by donating. You can go to our website www.contemporaryartmusicproject.org and simply click the donate button. Help us continue our podcast, festival, and other exciting projects. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.